I guess I'll leave it to you. Bob is a horology lecturer, author, and former restorer of clocks.
Yes,
so
yeah.
I'll let him tell you a little bit more about the work he did on the clock. Thank you for coming.
All right, great. Thank you all for coming out. I'm glad you didn't have to come through the snow or the rain here. But on a nice night, it was a nice ride down here too. So thanks for coming. Maybe you read a little bit about me, but I've been 1980. I met somebody who was doing antique clock and watch stuff. Nice to see you.
How are you?
And I decided this was for me, and it was a hobby, and then it became a full-time business in the early 1990s. And since then, I've repaired about 8,000 clocks, some of them in North Reading, and including the one upstairs in the library. And I was a dealer. I've sold about 1,800 old clocks and watches over my time, although I don't do that anymore. The ones I buy, I get to keep now. So that's better, I guess, but it makes me a little more selective so the house doesn't explode with clocks. And I'm also very active in our various collector associations too, because the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors still has about 10,000 members, and I organized conferences for them for several years, including in Germany and at the MFA in Boston, at the Henry Ford Museum. So I tried to put on some good shows wherever we were, and I'm active in the clock and watch activities in England as well. I'm going there in 2 weeks to give 4 lectures over there, including one at the British Museum. So I try to stay busy and active in this. You know, I have my niche, but luckily there's more than 4 other people in the world that are interested in it. Hey, I know this guy too, but they let anybody in here. All right, nice to see you, Mark.
Good to see you too.
And in case they get bored with clocks, he can talk about trees, right? And tools, and old tools too, right? In fact, I was going to mention that Mark's sort of like me, but he loves old tools instead of old clocks, even though he loves old clocks too. So if you have, you know, like an old crescent wrench in your cellar you're not using anymore, right? Mark would be happy to take it home and get it all shined up and make it look pretty. So, but tonight we're going to talk about how people told time here in New England, and then I'll spend a little time talking about that lovely clock upstairs that I knew was not working for some years, and then was able to convince them to let me make it work. And part of the deal is I come and give a talk about it too. Again, I'm not charging for this. I'm not taking hard-earned North Reading taxpayers' money. I do this just as my missionary work, where I want people to love clocks 1% of as much as I do, and then that's a success story. This is the former director here, Helena Minton. I just wanted to show her picture because she's still a good friend of ours. But the last time I spoke here, when Grant was president, she was the director, and she kind of arranged for me to speak here. I don't think anybody here was here the last time I was in. Oh, okay. Well, you can go because it's all the same stuff. No, not really. So anyway, I thank Helena for inviting me and for continuing to be a good friend of ours. She, as you know, is a published poet and does readings around, and that I just took her picture not too long ago at an event in Concord. So, and this is the front door of my house in Andover. We live in one of these Shawshene Village homes in Andover. Oh, now I got to start over again. Good evening, and thank you. You're fine. You didn't miss anything important. And Veltime came to me as the name that my business could be when I was starting in business in the early 1990s. And I got the name from Winslow Homer's 1868 engraving that was in Harper's Weekly, where he's showing mill workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He came to Lawrence because his brother was kind of a high-up chemist in the textile plants here, so he got to know it. And then Harper's Weekly was doing a special about the mill system in Lawrence, and the name of this is Bell Time, because as you may know, in Lawrence, you know, the bells kind of rule people's lives there, the same way that clocks do now. So if the third bell rang when you were on your way into the mill, the gates were closed and you couldn't work that day and you'd lose that day's pay. So we see the bell tower from the Atlantic Mill, which isn't there anymore. But you see these workers who are coming. So that was a great inspiration when I was trying to think of a name for my business and not just like Bob's Old Clocks. You know, I needed something a little catchier than that. The only problem is that sometimes people say, "Oh, bell tone, you know, I can't hear too well." So they think I'm a hearing aid guy, but we get past that. So this is Winslow Homer. I just thought I'd connect you with that art. I'm planning to get a suit like that someday, but he was quite a dapper fellow, as you may know. And this is his studio and home where he lived the last 20 years of his life, up on Prout's Neck near Portland. And it's now owned by the Portland Art Museum. You can go there. You have to arrange a special tour because you can't drive right up there. It's in a residential area. But it's a great place to visit and sort of commune with where Winslow Homer spent, again, the last 20 years of his life. And if you had turned around, this is the view you would have seen from his house, and you can understand some of the inspiration for his beautiful paintings of seaside places and waves crashing and everything else. Usually it's a little grayer and the waves are bigger in his paintings, but you get the idea. But I did find this picture of the inside of Winslow Homer's studio. It was shortly after he died, but you see there's two clocks in that picture. And I remember probably 20 years ago when I was doing clock repair, a woman called and came in and she said, "I have Winslow Homer's clock." You know, and I hear that kind of stuff all the time. George Washington's, you know, teeth, I have those too. But, oh, okay, great. But, you know, I thought maybe it was right because she was from that area. And it turns out that that was the clock that I restored for that woman. But it gets even better because here's this long case clock, and I'm thinking, well, you know, it'd be great to find that clock. But I'm sure it's long gone. You know, who knows where that is. And I even tried to find it, but then we went to a lecture by William Cross, who just did a nice biography of Winslow Homer, and he and almost like it's a big thick book, but I toughed it out. I read through the whole thing, and towards the end, he talked about the grandfather clock in Winslow Homer's studio as he lay dying, and it said, "And as the clock struck the half hour, you know, Winslow passed away." But I knew that this kind of clock does not strike the half hour. So I felt like that was a darn good reason to contact Bill Cross, who lives in Cape Ann, and, you know, said, "Bill, you know, how did you find out, you know, about this clock and the fact that it, you know, and I hate to tell you, but that doesn't strike the half hours." And he was very gracious. You know, most people would have, you know, who's this guy? Because clock guys, you know, sometimes can be know-it-all types, but not me. But so anyway, it turns out that he says, "Well, I know the guy who owns the clock now." And it turns out that this is a descendant of Winslow Homer's brother. Winslow Homer was not married, didn't have any kids, but his brother had kids, and this guy is a direct descendant of Homer, still lives up on Prout's Neck, very close to the studio, and he owns the clock. So that was a great thing. I restored, sort of like here, I restored it for free just so I could get my hands on it. And he was very happy, and I'm happy to get communed with Homer. You know, maybe there was one, you know, molecule of DNA left on there from Homer, so maybe I really was communing with him. But that was a great opportunity. And that's a long explanation for why my company is named Beltime. But I think it's interesting too. But this is my boat. No, this is the Mayflower, and this is it sort of raises the question of how many clocks and watches were on the Mayflower when it came over in 1620, and the answer is 0. Because most people didn't have clocks and watches back then. They were expensive, they were unreliable, and certainly the people on the Mayflower were not affluent and would not have had the wherewithal to own a clock. Here we see them getting on board the Mayflower in Europe before they came across the Atlantic, and you see nobody's got a grandfather clock on their shoulder as they're getting on the boat. So there's the proof right there, of course, of what I'm saying. But they had other ways of telling time and one of them was sandglasses. You can't tell what time it is from a sandglass, but this tells you how much time has gone by. And on shipboard, if any of you were in the Navy, you know there's those series of watches where there's 4-hour watches divided into half-hour sections from 1 to 8. And if you have a Chelsea clock, you know it strikes ship's bells. So these were half-hour sandglasses, and the helmsman would turn it over when it was empty. But if he was out there in the snow and the sleet and freezing, he might sneak and turn it over before it was empty. So that was a case of called eating sand. And if they did that enough times, they could actually reverse night and day on the boat by sneaking in before this got turned over. So, but of course, when the other thing that they would do is ring the bell. So you get that series of bells from 1 to 8 before they start over. This is a Winslow Homer painting. There's another one called 8 Bells. It's at the Addison Gallery, just down the street from here. But you know, they would ring the bells through those 8-hour watches. So if you weren't, if you weren't within sight of that sandglass, you still every half hour you knew basically where you were. So this is the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which was done before they landed. But what not everybody knows is that the Mayflower first arrived in Provincetown. They were not yet had not yet gone to Plymouth, and they were there for about 6 weeks thinking about if that would be a place to set up shop or not. Of course, they were trying to go to Virginia, so they were already kind of in the wrong place, and it was starting to get cold. But this was the Mayflower Compact because, again, as you may know, more than half of the passengers were not the Puritans. You know, they were other people, they were the crew, and they had to figure out a way of governing the community when they were there. So this is Provincetown Harbor, which Jean and I enjoy every summer. I don't think it looked quite like that when the Mayflower was out there, but I like showing this because the Mayflower was parked out there for several weeks while, again, they were figuring out what to do next. And there is a plaque there because 4 members of the Mayflower party died while they were there in Provincetown. So this is a little memorial done in 1920 for the people whose voyage and trip to the New World ended right there before they even got to get established in the Plymouth plantation. So, okay, does that mean 9 times up? As communities like North Reading got more prosperous and built meeting houses and churches, if they had enough money or a local rich guy, there would be a clock in the tower as well. So it was kind of a sign that in New England, as it was earlier in Europe, that if your community had developed enough financially and in size and all, there would not only be towers, but there would be clocks in those towers. So that was sort of the beginning of public timekeeping before maybe individuals had clocks and watches in their houses. And that started even in the 1600s. Again, not in the Mayflower time, but by the end of the 1600s, particularly in Boston, there were some public clocks and clockmakers at work already. This is another church, an old church in Newburyport. And again, I've been up in that tower. And again, it's another example of these sort of iconic white churches of New England, some of them with clocks in the towers. This is a view of the machine that sits in there now. I have to say that the Congregational Library Archives is in Boston on Beacon Street. And they recently got a collection of about 400 lantern slides of Connecticut Congregational churches. And I thought, this is great, you know, let me go through these and I can see how, you know, look at all the church clocks that were there. So I went through 400 lantern slides, and only about 60 of them had clocks in the steeples. So the rest of those towns just cheaped out on having a clock in the tower. It was kind of disappointing, but at least I got 60 nice examples of churches with clocks in their towers. And this is a kind of machinery that would have been inside, but this is what, and that was what was in that tower in Newburyport, but this is what originally was in that tower of Newburyport. This movement was made in probably the early 1700s, and then it belonged to a clock nut friend of mine who had it in his garage. We recently had it in an exhibit at Gordon College. that a few of you attended, and now it's on loan to Old Newbury, the museum in Newburyport. So it's kind of made a full circle of coming back to the town where it ticked and struck the hours some centuries ago.
What powered that? Was it weight?
Yes, they would be heavy weights, just usually in boxes that were filled with rocks and sand and things that would run that, but hundreds of pounds was required. There's clock guys of mine that still manually wind the clock in Reading, the tall clock with the clock in it. My friend took me up there. They go up there every week and wind those weights. You know, they got biceps like Popeye, but I guess they get paid for it. Yeah. So reason I'm showing this is George Whitefield, and he was a extremely popular, active evangelical printer and a preacher in the 1700s. That traveled both around England and came to America several times. And he was in Newburyport, and no doubt heard that clock ticking and striking, and died there. And he's buried in that church. The picture you just saw, that he was he worked hard, and supposedly Ben Franklin liked him. Ben Franklin did an experiment where he went to one of these group sessions outdoors where Whitefield was preaching, and he tried to figure out how far away he could be and still hear Whitefield, because he would preach to 10,000 people sometimes would gather, and he realized he could be back like almost a quarter of a mile and he would still hear Whitefield preaching. So he was getting very strong voice and popular, and I guess even while he then was sleeping, he heard that clock ticking above him in the tower. This is the Topsfield Town Hall. So some of these clocks were in the public buildings, the town hall, not in the churches. And I recently visited that and went up into the tower there too. And there's the guy who's the keeper of it. It has an electric motor. He doesn't have to wind it, but he goes up there all the time to check on it. And that's the old movement that's inside that tower. The cool thing about it, as he explained too, was that this was not a striking clock, so it just told the time. And the minister of this church said, you know, we should have some bells, you know, ringing the time here. It tells people when to come, or at least one bell so they know it's time. So what they did is they ran a wire across the street from here to here into that tower, and they put another system in there to ring the bells, and it was tripped by the clock here and went across. So I thought that was a great way to solve that problem. I don't know how long that wire was there, but they did it for some years. And this is a church in the old center in North Andover too. That it was a congregational church. Now it's Unitarian, and there's the Howard and Company movement that's inside there. So as you can tell, I love going up in these towers and seeing what's there. Usually I have to sign the waiver, so if I fall down the stairs, you know, I don't own the church or the town hall afterwards. But these are important machines, and this is the factory that made those Howard clocks and watches. They were commercial clocks, but I've restored public clocks around, like in the Andover library. There's a nice Howard clock in there that I restored and did a speech about that in my own town in Andover. The building's not there anymore, but they were one of the premier clockmaking firms that made turret tower clock movements and big other commercial clocks as well. In that tower, there's bell, like in many places, but if you read the fine print, this is Paul Revere. Paul Revere not only galloped around saying, you know, the regulars. He didn't say the British are coming, because we all were British back then. So he said the regulars are coming. But after the war, he became quite prosperous as in metalwork. He did the copper sheathing for the Constitution's hull, and they did bell casting. There's more than 100 churches in New England that have Paul Revere bells in them. And there's an ad that he would place talking about the fact that he does these church and academy bells for sale. It was in Boston, and eventually they had a bigger factory down in Canton where they were doing this bell casting as well. So the other way people told time was sundials, because as long as it's sunny out, I mean, it wouldn't work now, but if it's not cloudy and it's sunny, the sundial was like the arbiter. So as long as the gnomon is sticking up and casting the shadow, you pretty much know what time it is, even though the sundials need to be adjusted for clock time, because the sun time varies just because of the way the Earth and the sun interact. But people would carry little pocket sundials around with them too. You know, they'd pull it out, and they weren't trying to launch the space shuttle with these things. You know, they just roughly needed to know what time it was, because they often record the time that they were doing things, and a sundial was, you know, the way to do it. Your watch could stop, get broken, you know, be telling the wrong time, but the sundial was going to work when the sun was here. But I show this pocket sundial because this was very much like what was in the pocket of Captain John Smith when he was captured by the Native Americans who were about to beat his brains out. The story is not quite as the same as we hear about Pocahontas rushing in and saving him, because he had already saved himself by showing them his pocket sundial. And the Native Americans were, oh, that's cool, and he kind of explained how it worked. Then Pocahontas showed up and, you know, said, maybe, you know, we should let this guy live, you know, because he's got this cool thing, and also he's kind of handsome, I guess. Maybe she was thinking the same thing. So, and another guy who had a pocket sundial was Roger Williams. He was the founder of Rhode Island. This shows him I assume it's not a photograph, it's a rendition of him arriving in Providence, getting a peace pipe, but his pocket sundial still exists. It's in the collection of the Rhode Island Historical Society. And these pocket sundials had to have compasses in them because you needed to orient it correctly for it to show the right time. If it's on a pedestal in your garden, it's already set up the way it's supposed to be. But when it's in your pocket, you need to set it pointing the right direction so the shadow points in the right direction. So this is not me. This is somebody else who you may recognize. This is Ben Franklin. And of course, he did many important things for our country. But one of the things he did was design the first continental currency. As you see, it's 1776. This is called the Fugio dollar. Fugio is Latin for it flies, or time flies. So he's saying time flies. And he's saying mind your business, meaning get busy, do work. It's not mind your own business. It's, you know, we got a country to build, a war to win. So we need to work, and we need to work when the sun is shining. So this was sort of a common symbol and metaphor for discipline and hard work. There's the sun shining down on the sundial on this Fugio coin. So you may have read in the introduction too that this book of mine was published just last year by the American Philosophical Society Press. They're the oldest learned society in America, founded by Ben Franklin in 1743 to try to promote useful knowledge. It wasn't so people could translate the Bible, you know, 4 ways into Hebrew. This was to try to do, you know, useful things, again, to grow our country. So he was lifelong friends with a clockmaker named Edward Duffield, and he was the subject of my biography, which is now about to win its 3rd national prize. So I'm kind of happy about that. I do have a couple of copies here if you want to own one. You can?
And the library owns a copy that circulates if anybody's interested in borrowing it.
Great, please read it. You don't need to own it, but I'd love you to own it if you'd like to. And there's a chapter, an entire chapter in there about Edward Duffield and Benjamin Franklin, because they knew each other their whole lives. And this is the award that I was given back in April by the American Philosophical Society for my book. The interesting thing too is the president of the APS is a guy named Roger Bagnall, and there's a very famous clockmaking family in Massachusetts called the Bagnalls, and supposedly he's kind of distantly related to them. So that was kind of a fun thing to learn about, and sort of circled back the whole clock story right there on the podium there. And this is my Edward Duffield clock. Fortunately, I was able to afford one. It's much better looking than your junky clock upstairs. No, just kidding. Yours is straight too. But there's differences. You know, this is a Philadelphia clock, and those were different. And I really had a learning curve because I was kind of recruited to write this book about Edward Duffield, and I really knew much more about New England clockmaking than I did about Philadelphia clockmaking. So it really was a learning curve for me, but it was great. And eventually I did have the opportunity to buy my own Duffield clock. And again, I think the hand of God reached down because every other Duffield clock is taller than 8 feet and would not have fit in my house. But as you can see, I didn't have to chop a hole in my ceiling. This one just fits in my house. So I'm very happy to be able to commune with Duffield. In addition to Homer, I can commune with Duffield the same way. So as we know that Duffield did not make the cases, he was a woodworkers and joiners made those, but these clocks worked with weights hanging down, as we were asked, and the pendulum swinging back and forth inside. And the reason I'm showing this is because before this song became popular at the American Centennial in 1876, nobody called those clocks grandfather clocks. If I'd gone back to Caleb Wheaton or Edward Duffield and said, hey, I'd like to buy one of your grandfather clocks, he says, well, my grandfather doesn't have a clock. So they were not called that until this song became popular, and some of you may already be singing this in your head about when the old man died. But sort of after a while, everybody started to call these big floor standing clocks grandfather clocks. So
what did they call them?
They were sometimes 8-day clock, meaning it was weekly wind, because the smaller ones you had to wind every day, or long case clock sometimes too. But the other thing that was key, and as I mentioned, the clockmakers didn't make the case, was that in estate inventories and even other kinds of materials about theirs, it was clock and case. So if you said it was the clock, you were talking about the machine and the face. You weren't talking about the furniture. So they would differentiate between this, and only later, did we say, oh yeah, there's a nice Simon Willard clock in this case, but Simon Willard had nothing to do with 90% of what you see there. Those were jointed. They were not woodworkers. They were, metal workers essentially that did this. So this is a clock by Simon Willard, one of the most famous names of New England clockmaking. And this is, again, not a photograph, but I think a good rendition of Simon Willard. And this is an example of how once people, still somewhat affluent, but private citizens could own grandfather clocks, and more people had them in their houses. They still weren't inexpensive at this time. But one of my other projects, and I'd be happy to come talk about that too, is horology, the science of timekeeping, horology and art, because I've written, lectured, collected images of fine art paintings going back to before the Renaissance, and I look for paintings like this that have clocks and watches in them. So in this case, people could read these paintings. These told stories. Not everyone was even literate, but if they looked at this, they would know that this was a sophisticated family because they had a very nice, tall grandfather clock within the room. This is from about 1820. This is called a frolic. These were sort of supervised parties where young people could congregate and flirt and all, but be under the watchful eye of the elders. So there's a lot going on here, musicians and people smoking and all. And here's the couple that they don't look like they're ready to frolic particularly yet, but maybe as the punch goes around, things will lighten up a little bit. And this is another example of one of those horology and art paintings. This is by Robert Peckham, who was a deacon down in Bolton, Massachusetts, and this is of his family. It's the Pecker-Sawyer family. This painting is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and we see again a tall case clock, a grandfather clock in the corner, so we know that this is kind of sophisticated. The house is still there in Bolton where this painting was done. But if you look more closely, even though it's summer, the light's shining in, but the shutters are closed and people aren't looking too happy. And that's because this is a posthumous painting. This little girl, Elizabeth, had died about 3 months before this painting was done, but it was not uncommon for families to want paintings, portraits of the deceased person within the family still. They're still being remembered. They're still part of the family, even if they're no longer living. So there's been exhibits of these kinds of things. They're kind of moving in a way, but we do know that little Elizabeth no longer physically was with the family. This is another painting by Robert Peckham. You see the children were much larger back then. So you can see that this kid is bigger than her parents, I think. But again, as you probably spotted already, there's the watch being firmly held by Mom, but the kids also got a grip on the chain and the little seal there too that would be used to put the seal on the hot wax if they were closing up an envelope. So there was an itinerant painter named Joseph Davis, a left-handed painter. He would go house to house, town to town, and kind of move in and do these quick watercolor portraits. And whether or not they had a banjo clock on the wall, we don't know, but they could have said that, yeah, we want, let's make us look richer, let's put a banjo clock in the picture. They probably did have a little kitty and a kid, but whether they had a banjo clock, we can't be sure. This is Eli Terry, an important part of the New England clockmaking story, because he developed the way to mass produce the wooden movements like I passed around here. Because before that, clocks were pretty much made one by one. If you were lucky, you could make 10 or 12 in a year. But he was already starting to make movements out of wood, as had been done in the Black Forest in Germany before that, because we had plenty of wood around here, but not a lot of brass. The British didn't want us to have brass or be able to make brass, so you had to melt down grandma's candlestick, to get some brass to make a clock out of. So wooden movements were important, and he took a contract to make thousands of them in a 3-year period, and he did, and suddenly clocks became much more affordable for average people. This is one of his early factories down there in central Connecticut, again powered by water power, as you see there. And this was one of the early styles called pillar and scroll clock. And it was still weight driven, but the weights descended inside the clock along the channels. But as you see, there's the wooden movement inside. You couldn't make the escape wheel, that little wheel, you couldn't make that out of wood. The teeth were, it would be too small and too fragile. But pretty much everything else could be made out of wood, and typically the wheels were cherry, nice, close, tight grain wood. Some of these other parts were oak, and the long shafts were made out of laurel. That was a good wood for using these kinds of things. And you probably see Seth Thomas' names there. He was, again, he was typical in American business. He was the second guy and then he made all the money. Eli Terry got rich too, but Seth Thomas really got rich because he bought out Terry and then, made the business into something much, much bigger. And these clocks were sold by peddlers. There was no Jordan's Furniture back then. These guys, again, like the artists, they would go town to town, farmhouse to farmhouse, peddling all kinds of things, including clocks. So this is Chauncey Jerome. So in the 1830s, he finally figured out a way to make cheap clocks out of brass. We finally were making brass here. There was a good supply of them, and he developed a style of clock called the OG clock, based on kind of the reverse S shape of that molding. And this had a nice big opening in the dial, so you could see it was a brass clock, not one of those cheap wooden clocks, so that your neighbors would be impressed by seeing that. So these became hugely popular. They were made for another half century. They went to England. They were popular everywhere, and that's what the brass movement looks like inside there. So again, pretty simple, mass-produced, stamped out, but it was inexpensive to make, and pretty much anybody could afford a clock at that point. And some of those clocks were made right here, as you see, Reading, Massachusetts. Daniel Pratt was a local clockmaker. He did not make those wooden movements. Those he bought from the Connecticut makers, but he made the cases here, and he eventually also had a showroom in Boston, but Reading is where the work was done. There's a couple other examples of Daniel Pratt clocks. You see an OG clock and then another style of clock too, often with these reverse painted glasses or mirrors in the door like that. So this is Daniel Pratt looking extremely happy. But maybe he didn't want his picture taken, I'm not sure. And maybe he was past the years of making clocks at all, but I love the fact that we do have a picture of Daniel Pratt, and we also have a picture of where he is sleeping now. His tomb is right there in Reading, within sight of that church I mentioned, where the guys line the clock up every week. So you can go visit Daniel Pratt as well. So a style of clock that became popular after that, later in the 1800s here in New England, made in Connecticut, were these black mantle clocks. They were designed to look like French marble clocks that were 10 times more expensive, but these were made out of wood or iron, painted black, shiny black, so they looked like marble. And again, pretty much anybody could have one. They cost maybe $3, $4, which could have been a week's pay, but not a year's pay, so plenty of people could afford them. And again, that was the clock. People didn't have, you know, something blinking on their microwave, you know, and 4 other clocks in their bedroom. You know, that was the clock in the house, and it was treasured and kept and passed down, and that's why there's so many old antique clocks now, because people didn't throw them out then or now. You don't want to throw away grandma's clock. She looked at it, you know, 100 times a day. It was important to her. And they were important to all kinds of people. This is a picture of a woman and her 2 kids fleeing from the Great Fire in Salem, Massachusetts in 1914. So you see, you know, she had 2 kids. Maybe she had more kids she left behind because she wanted the clock. But she's got her suitcase, and she's got that black mantel clock under her arm as she's going away. And if you don't know about or think maybe the Salem fire was in 1914 wasn't that serious, this is what Salem looked like after that fire. And that's why people really didn't want their houses to catch on fire or their barns, because, you know, this basically destroyed most of the city of Salem back then. So I guess she was lucky to get out with her kids and her clock. So if you like this subject a lot, there's places to go and experience more of these things. The American Clock and Watch Museum is down there in Bristol, Connecticut. They have a great collection, hundreds of American clocks that you can see, many of which, you know, would have been in houses all over Reading and Andover and New England. Again, because most people had them and could afford them. Old Sturbridge Village is another one of those iconic white churches, but there's a clock with a steeple in it, and there's an example in their Cheney Clock Gallery of all the American clocks that they have lined up in there that you can visit. And one of the most important places is the Willard House Clock Museum. It's in Grafton. They have more Willard clocks than anywhere in the world. And this is where the Willards lived at the beginning and developed their clockmaking business. And there's a clock shop in there that's a recreation of the Willard clock shop. And it's the only clock shop in America that's still originally on its original foundation. So if you're right there, again, you can commune with the Willards because you're on that same floor, you're in that same space that they occupied making clocks in the late 1700s.
Hey, Bob, if you go back one picture for a second.
Oh, the tool guy, right?
That's right. Here's one of those wire pulling plates that we looked at the other day.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and these are taps, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
That's right.
sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah,
that's
no.
exactly like the one we were looking at.
Yeah, no, that's important. Well, anyway, you know, I guess go there when it's not crowded and you can take one home. They got so much, they wouldn't miss it anyway. All right. Now, the good part, right? This is your clock that's sitting upstairs and now ticking, and every hour alerting the staff up there that another hour of their life has gone by, right?
Yeah.
And pretty soon they can go home, right? Is that what it's good for?
Sometimes we put it a little early so that we can go out and get people out of the building and close.
Yeah, you aren't the first people to have done that. You know, and a lot of times, especially, you know, in England, in those big country houses, I mean, that top was locked because the servants would be tempted, you know, to play around with the timekeeping. So
Just embarking on an old tradition, I guess.
yeah, that's right. That's right. I think you should do that. And I think I may recall that there was a locking system in there that's now disabled. But there's something, there's a piece that doesn't allow you to open the door unless you kind of reach inside and do something. So anyway, it was great to see this clock and really to get quite well acquainted of it when it was, when the movement, I didn't take the whole case, when the movement was there in my shop getting worked on. So on the face of the clock, it does not say Caleb Wheaton. And you know, that always kind of raises red flags. Is this really a Caleb Wheaton clock? And we still don't know for sure. But this is written in there kind of clumsily, but you know, seems old and you know, authoritative. But this kind of says Caleb, you know, it doesn't spell Caleb right, but it says Caleb Wheaton Long Clock 1802, and that would be the right kind of time period for Caleb Wheaton to have made this clock. As you see, there's all kinds of other writing here about who worked on it and some family information, but that's what's telling us that it's a Caleb Wheaton clock, and you know, until we know otherwise. But it's like so many other clocks that it's not like you can look at anything else in the clock and say, oh, this is his work for sure. But You know, again, we're not trying to sell this or bring it to Antiques Roadshow, so you know, we can say it's a Caleb Wheaton clock, and that's okay. This clock was restored years ago by this fellow, Mr. Guard, right?
Bob Bernard, yeah.
Yeah. So, and he did some research on it too, which was interesting for me. So he got it going and did some research about it too, and an article published over the provenance about it, and it was saying it was given to the town by Elliot Flint in memory of his father, Henry Sanborn Flint, in 1947, and this is, again, the donor. So I did a little fun digging about Charles Henry S. Flint, because that's the name on it that it's dedicated to. So here we have a description of Caleb Wheaton, and it's saying one of the best-known clockmakers of his time. So, you know, it's an important clock. If it is a Caleb Wheaton clock, it's as important historically as other clocks from that period. There's the movement that I restored. That's what's sitting behind the dial there. Again, the makers didn't put their names on it, but there's nothing that distinctive about this that would tell us who made it. There's all the parts. So sometimes I get it back together or don't have parts left over. But you know, these look like pretty much every other grandfather tall case clock from that period. You know, it has the same kinds of wheels doing the same kinds of things. The only thing a little different about that is this little rectangular cutout at the bottom, because most clocks did not have that. They just had a regular flat rectangle. And I looked for other examples, and I couldn't find any with that same kind of rectangular cutout at the bottom. So it may mean something, and if we dig further, it may tell us something. So here we have, again, that plate that's on the clock in memory of Henry S. Flint. So, you know, it tells us a little bit. He was a whaleman, you know, merchant, was in the gold rush, and died in Providence in 1897. I'll be in Providence next week because I'm speaking to the Pottery and Porcelain Club there, because there are many beautiful clocks in porcelain cases. So I'll be talking about them, not Caleb Wheaton when I'm there. But this is the homestead in Reading where Henry S. Flint was born and spent the first couple of years of his life. As you see, Bunker Hill tree on the right was destroyed with the house. So that's no longer there. But there's our guy. There's Dr. Flint. And he was Dr. Flint because he was one of these guys that did patent medicines, you know, and became a billionaire, well, a millionaire, by selling stuff made out of herbs and everything that supposedly would make you healthy. So there's Dr. Flint, as you see, proprietor of the Quaker Bitters. That was his, and here's his obituary. So I found out that this definitely is the guy. Henry S. Flint is the one who did the Quaker Bitters. The weird thing too is it's Henry Sanborn Flint, and I have a good friend, another clock guy named Steve Sanborn. So I asked Steve if he was related, and he said no, but I'm sure he probably didn't want to be connected with the snake oil guy, so he denied it. This is a fun picture I had of Steve at a clock auction during the preview when we could look at all the clocks we were going to bid on later on. So Dr. Flint put out these sort of fake bills, $500 reward for any medicines equal in quality, you know, to all the internal difficulties and derangements. So I guess he probably hoped you died so you couldn't say, hey, it didn't work and where's my 500? I don't know if anybody ever cashed one of these in, but this was a great thing to see about Henry S. Flint. And I guess, Emily, you need to have one of these, you know, taped up on the wall there too.
Maybe we should.
Yeah, I think so. So this was the back of that card. So this is talking about one of the standard medicines, you know, how it's just going to quicken your blood, cheer the mind, passage down, restores the pleasure and joy of youth. So if anybody's got a bottle of this around, you know.
How much alcohol was in it?
Yeah, probably on 98%. And the rest was opium.
Yeah. That's right.
And you felt great. Yeah, that's right. And all your cares were gone. So here's Bob Guard's card in there too, and some other notations inside the clock. And this is the dial or the face of the clock, as we see here, nicely painted. Again, this was sort of typical of these faces. And we know that Caleb Wheaton had nothing to do with this dial because this is, let me first say too, that these painted dials came after the typical composite brass dials like are on Mullican clocks. And Mullicans are my next project. We're about halfway through a big book about them. They made clocks here in Massachusetts in the 1700s, this one in Newburyport. But just so you know the difference, so this is a painted dial that became popular in the late 1770s and pretty much supplanted the brass dials. They were cheaper to make, easier to read, and most of them were produced in Birmingham, England. So this is the back of your dial. So right away, you know, I wasn't blowing smoke here, you know, it says Osborne right there, and we know that Osborne was one of the makers of these sort of prefabricated painted dials that were imported from Birmingham and then could be fit up to the clock movement that the local clockmaker would make. So here's, again, about Tom. This is a little history of him. He was with Wilson in the 1770s. They split up later in the 1770s, and they continued to make these dials for some decades afterwards. Here's another example of an Osborne dial. In this case, not only has his name, but it says manufacturing in Birmingham. And in this case, too, you can even see on the calendar wheel that's back here, it also says Osborne in Birmingham. So, I mean, that's part of its story, and it's interesting that if that's a Caleb Wheaton movement, that he sourced one of these painted dials and put it on his movement. There are other Caleb Wheaton clocks around, you know, big, beautiful ones as well, that do not have these painted dials. This is a silver dial, and there's two examples of these, which has this Latin phrase up top in addition to his name and place of location, and this is what it means: on this moment depends eternity, because clocks really were a symbol of mortality, that you needed to be aware of how your time was being spent in this world, because the next world was waiting for you. So, but you know, right there on the clock. So every time you looked at the clock, you were thinking, well, I'll be dead soon, so I better, I better live my life well. So here's again another Caleb Wheaton clock, which also has that same wording of it down here below. And again, this is not subtle. You see an hourglass here with the Father Time scythe right there on top of the hourglass. So the message was not ambiguous. Yeah.
Bob, were they making these sort of clock faces to order, or ordering them from England to your preference, or did they kind of have a bunch that they had on spec that ranged from sort of your bog standard painted face to maybe your, you know, pretty posh engraved, you know? Yes, yes. There were, you know, importers in Boston and Philadelphia who ordered, you know, 20, 50 of these dials at a time. You know, I've seen the orders, I've seen the ads where they're offering them for sale. So they, see, the good thing about them is they were kind of universal. That was the point of that extra plate behind the dial, because then you could match it up to a movement. If you just got a dial with posts sticking out of it, those posts might not be in the right place to attach to your movement. So that false plate that was there with the Osborne name on it allowed him to attach it, because he could put the next set of posts wherever he wanted them. So that was there. But yes, they were commodities that you know, Caleb Wheaton might have gotten to in Providence, or he might have gone to Boston and bought 10 dials and been ready to go. These were different. These were sheet dials. These were silvered brass dials, and these were custom made. They were spec. They were engraved and done one at a time when they needed them, because they didn't have that false plate. You had to know the movement you were going to attach it to before you put the posts on and everything, or else it wouldn't fit. And here is again is the top of that. The top of a Benjamin Willett clock. He was one of the brothers, and he has that same Latin phrase at the top. So this was not just done by Caleb Wheaton. Other people thought too that, you know, people needed to be reminded constantly of living their lives the right way. And again, you see this is Roxbury there, which is where the Willets worked. And here's yet another one. This has a moon dial up in the top there. This showed the face of the moon. Some people say, yeah, I got a beautiful clock that has the sun and the moon up at the top. It does not have the sun and the moon. It's only the moon, and the moon goes around. There's actually 2 moons, because the lunar cycle is 29 and a half days, and you can't have a gear with 29 and a half teeth.
So you have 2 moons on there, and this rotates every 2 months, but it shows essentially the phases of the moon and how many days into the lunar cycle you are by that up there. So here's another Caleb Wheaton clock with some stars up in the top there. This is Delaney Antique Clocks. They're the major big seller of all kinds of antique clocks out in West Townsend. If people want to go and look at 100 tall case clocks, that's the place to go, because they're just bursting with these clocks. But they sell some of them, and it's a good place to go and see them. And there's another example. So this too is a Caleb Wheaton clock that doesn't say Caleb Wheaton on the dial, but they know it's Caleb Wheaton because it says his name on the pendulum bob. So it's inscribed there. Of course, somebody could have swapped out the pendulum, but it seems kind of clear that the pendulum started life with the clock, and it is a Caleb Wheaton clock. And here's another nice example too. A few more of these, again with these nice brass dials. And this is the oddest of all, because this is a little bracket clock, and it's a musical one, but it also has Caleb Wheaton's name on it. So this would have been on the shelf, and you see he did sign his name on the back of this beautiful movement that's inside that beautiful Providence case. So there's a book where somebody has compiled all these ads of that Caleb Wheaton placed in the newspapers of the time. So here, this first one, he's saying how somebody broke in his place. Luckily, they didn't get away with stuff, but he's saying, "Stop thief." And this is 1787, Providence Gazette down here too. He's looking for an apprentice. Here, he's saying he has a nice assortment of gold and silver watches. He did not make watches. These were all English watches that he imported. Sometimes he would put his name on them, but they were all English products. And here's an example of a Caleb Wheaton signed watch. But again, it's English, and he would have just marketed it there. Here's the information about it, talking about this Caleb Wheaton. It says at least 10 of these watches are known, dating from this period. So he wanted to sell watches just like my guy, Edward Duffield. He sold watches, English watches, with his name on them as well. So we've reached the end of the story here. This is one of my horology and art paintings. Even though you might, this is great, Bob, but I don't see a clock. This is the top of Mount Mansfield, which is the tallest mountain in Vermont. And this is a party, this is an 1860s oil painting. This party has climbed to the top, but you may be noticing that the shadows are getting kind of long, and it's probably getting kind of late, and maybe they're not thinking about the trip down. But this is an enlargement of that detail of the painting, and you see this fellow is holding his watch up and saying, if we don't want to go down this mountain in the dark, maybe it's time to go now. So I'll take that as my cue to say it's my time to go now, but I'm happy to answer some questions or look at any clocks or watches that you might have brought in. All right, nobody fell asleep. That's a good sign. Maybe you're thinking about the cookies, right? So that kept you going.
I have a question.
Oh, let me take the camera guy first, yeah. Is the camera off now? So.
No.
Oh, it's still going, so I have to watch my language?
Are there formulas for calculating the gears in a clock of a given diameter and so many teeth?
Yes.
To mesh with another gear of certain diameter, so many teeth?
Yeah, there's a big, thick book from the 1813, which was not the first one to do that. But there's all kinds of formulas in there. I mean, you only have to do it right once, and then you can copy it. But figuring it out is quite difficult, and unless it's a long case clock where the pendulum swings seconds, you have to do all those computations so that the minute hand goes around in an hour and not in 43 minutes.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a ton of math, and the clockmakers, I mean, I'm speaking modestly here, but the clockmakers were sort of the smartest guys at that time. Because there was no baloney. It worked or it didn't. You couldn't say, well, all right, it loses 10 minutes an hour, but still beautiful, it ticks. That didn't wash. So these were people that had to know math, they had to know metallurgy, they had to know physics, and often then clockmakers and watchmakers went on to other industries, like the textile industry and the machinist industries, all those machinist places in Connecticut that started the Industrial Revolution. Most of those people that started all that machining and tool making had been watch and clockmakers to begin with, so they were important. And Again, they needed to either figure it out themselves or get those books which said, if this wheel has 42 teeth, this one has to have 7 teeth, and so on, so that that minute hand goes around in an hour. Good question, though. Thank you. Yes, sir.
When did the wristwatch replace the pocket watch in popularity?
Before World War I, women started to wear bracelet watches, and they even went farther back than that. But no self-respecting guy would have a wristwatch. It was like, this is feminine. You got to have that turnip in your pocket, and pull it out and look at it. Except in World War I, when the guy was in the trench, and he pulls his pocket watch out, the next thing he gets shot in the head. So it was much more convenient to have a wristwatch. So wristwatches became sort of useful, and they didn't have that feminine aura too much anymore after that. But there were trench watches, they were called, that actually had metal covers on them for the guys in the trenches who didn't want to be fumbling with their pocket watch. But it still took a while, and the Swiss got on that faster than the Americans, because companies like Waltham and Elgin kept, even after World War I and all, they kept cranking out the pocket watches, and this is what the manly men want. But meanwhile, a lot of manly men, especially in the 20s, they were more fashionable. They wanted a wristwatch, and the Swiss were happy to send millions over here and make them, and the American companies were kind of slow on the uptake to start making wristwatches as well. But got to admit, it's a little more convenient, and also with Lindbergh too, because he had a wristwatch that was actually made to fit on the side of his wrist, so that when he was holding on for dear life, waiting to hope he'd see France eventually, he didn't have to turn his wrist like this to look at it. So, that was another thing where maybe if Lindbergh wore a wristwatch, maybe it was okay for another guy to have one too. So, yes, sir.
A couple of slides back, you have, excuse me, a slide of the Delaney Watch Company in West Townsend.
Well, they're a dealer, yep.
It's a guy that's associated with the Antique Roadshow named Delaney.
That's one of them.
Is he associated with or
Yes,
related to that
yeah.
company?
There's 2 sons. So John Delaney founded the company.
Okay.
In fact, he was a school teacher in this area somewhere and married a woman with a lot of money, and they decided to start collecting clocks. And eventually he didn't need to be a school teacher anymore, and founded this business. And he was like, the 500-pound gorilla in this business. If he was at the auction, you weren't going to buy anything, because he was there. But he founded that, and he has 2 sons who now run it. John, is fishing in Florida most of the time. But John A. Delaney and Sean Delaney, who both appear on the roadshow, are part of that company. And they're friends of mine. They're good guys. And I like them. And there's even a son now of John A. Delaney, Declan Delaney, who's involved in the business as well. So, it's great that they're doing it. They have a love for it. They have deep enough pockets, so they can hang on to inventory as long as they need to, and they can keep adding to it. But, plenty of times when I did clock repairs, people said, oh, I bought this clock at Delaney. So I know they overpaid for it, but they got a good clock. So, and again, if you only want one clock and you want to be sure it's good, why not go to the place where you have that assurance, and you'll pay extra, but, it's worth it. Yeah, that's right. Yes, Mark?
In your travels these days, looking at clocks and having people bring you clocks, are wooden movements really rare these days? Do you see them at all?
There's probably only about 500,000 of them left.
Still, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Dry out? You'd think they would have cracked over time? Or...
They use the right woods, where they left. Well, the other thing, there's tens of thousands unless I've repaired probably 200 of them. But I tell the people, you don't want to be running this because, but because of those woods, they do dry out. But they, you can kind of oil the wood too. But the other thing is that, there's Darwin in play here, because the one that was no good went into the wood stove in 1840. So the good ones are left. But there's still a lot of good ones left. So, yeah, I mean, if you wanted a wooden movement clock or 100 of them, within 2 months I could back the truck up to your house.
Yeah, I'll talk to you about that later. Okay. On the same vein, because he knows I'm a wood guy, an arborist, and a hand tool guy. Those movements, the spindles on the gears, I don't know the proper terms, but the seats they rode on, the bushings or the seats, was the shaft brass and were the bushings bronze or something? How did they keep those from wearing out?
Well, originally, the actual pivot, which is the thing that turns inside the hole, was a piece of steel wire. So that was hard. But it was turning in a hole drilled in that oak. And the cool thing about wood and oak is that it self-lubricates. You're not supposed to oil wooden movement clocks because there's oil in the wood that keeps it lubricated. Sometimes, you know, somebody says, "Oh, I've got to oil this thing," or worse, they use graphite. Somebody somehow thought, "Well, let's put some powdered graphite in there," you know, and that's just a mess. Some wooden movement clocks, they did use either brass or bronze or ivory. And it's on the label, it says ivory bushings or bronze bushings. So maybe those would last a little longer, but you know, there's plenty of original wooden movements where that hole is not worn. You know, it just turns. But again, the piece of steel that's turning in it is hard, and it's steel. So it's a...
Never thought about that. If you have the tannins in there and those kinds of oils, it would be...
Yeah, no, it's you know, actually a good system. And I've bushed those because sometimes that hole gets worn. But what I do is I cut a piece of dowel and I make a wooden bushing and drill a hole in it. So again, it's turning in wood, which is in a way more authentic to have it as a wooden bushing instead of, you know, in brass clocks you put a brass bushing in and that's what you're supposed to do. And you can brass bush a wooden clock, but then you have to oil it. And then the oil dries up and attracts dirt and everything, and you got to clean it more. So it actually was a great system, you know, that just luckily wood has oil in it. So it worked out that way. All right, anybody else? Oh, yes, in the back there first.
Well, how many clockmakers were there in New England in mid-late 1700s? I mean, if you have one, what are they, like, it was made by one of 500 people or 100 people? You know?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. I have a book here which lists Massachusetts by town,
Okay.
but it goes up into the middle of the 1800s.
Yeah.
In the 1700s, especially earlier in the 1700s, and this is part of the Mulligan book that I'm doing, you know, there were, you know, maybe 20 in Massachusetts, and they often had to make their living doing other things too. They were silversmiths, or they made buttons, or they repaired umbrellas. You know, I have 3 ledger books from the Mulligans, and it wasn't just clock repair. They were, you know, fixing buckles and things like that too. So there were some, but when you got to the era of mass-produced clocks, the Connecticut clocks, the wooden movement clocks, towns filled up because these things had to be serviced a lot. Andover had 3 watchmakers, 4, you know, at the beginning of the 1900s, because everybody's watch, you know, was dusty, the streets weren't paved, and you had smoky fireplaces and coal stoves. So your watches need to be cleaned every year or 2. It was a common thing, you know, that the watchmakers kept very busy. So there were a ton of them then, but you know, in the 18th century, they were expensive, they were handmade, you had to be rich. So you know, there weren't that many clocks, so you didn't need that many clockmakers, and they often had to do other things as well. So yes?
Did Ben Franklin ever dabble in clocks? He seemed to be the type of guy that was always looking to improve something.
Yeah, and I could have shown a picture of the weird clock that he invented. It was while he was in England. Do I have one? I don't think I have one in my iPad. But the point he was trying to, and this is when he was in England, but he was trying to develop a clock that was simpler and less expensive to make, so that more people could afford them, and that would help the clockmaking business. So he made a 3-wheel clock, you know, which has 1 or 2 fewer gears, and it has a hand, one hand, as all clocks did early on, but one hand that points at the hours, but the dial is divided into almost like ship striking thing, where it could be 12, 4, or 8 at the top. So you kind of had to know where you were in the day to know what time it was, and he figured, well, hell, you know if it's morning or afternoon or night. So, okay, you know, you're not going to mix up 12 or 4 or 8. So yes, he designed a clock when he was in England. I've seen prototypes of it. I own a reproduction of it because people thought this was kind of funny. So I have a London-made reproduction of a Franklin dial clock. There were even the little electric clocks with Franklin dials on them. But that's kind of the issue with rarity. Is that, oh, this clock's really rare. A lot of reasons they're rare is because nobody wanted them. So they didn't make a lot of them, so you know there aren't many left, and there weren't many to begin with. But they are interesting, and he tried. You know, it was an interesting idea, and he actually had 2 very important English clockmakers involved in the project. One was John Whitehurst, who you know was a very famous, and he made a couple of these prototypes of Franklin. And then James Ferguson, who was a scientist, you know, an astronomer and everything, he got on the act and he sort of tweaked the design to make it a little more understandable when you looked at the dial. So, you know, they thought, well, this could be an interesting idea. And there are clocks that have that dial, but, you know, again, I think people, you know, when it's 8 o'clock, you want to know it's 8 and maybe not 4 or 12 at the same time. So it doesn't work. But anyway, you know, if you want my card, I'm happy to send you some pictures of those things because they're pretty interesting. Yes, sir.
The reason why we don't use 24 divisions of the clock face, like they do in Europe, they tell you it's.
Well, that's another thing that I sometimes work into these talks because it wasn't until 1873 that we had time zones in America. There were 700 time zones in America, and it all depended on local noon. So when it was noon in North Reading, it was not noon in Boston, and it definitely wasn't noon in Albany. So back then, you know, it was a total mess, and the railroads went crazy, and trains crashed into each other and everything because there was no standard time. Finally, in 1883, we had the day of 2 noons, where 4 time zones were established in America, and everybody was kind of on the same page, and the train schedules got a lot simpler. So we kind of dealt with that problem, but we still have the AM/PM problem. So, and you know, which again doesn't make sense, and it was a tough fight to get time zones. You know, there were preachers thundering from Boston to San Francisco. You know, hey, God put the sun up there at noon, and you're not telling me it's noon some other time. You know, there was tremendous resistance to it. And the other kind of cool thing is this became a feminist thing, particularly in England, where the real suffragettes, the very active, rabid feminists, thought that standard time was like a male-imposed kind of domination of society. And I don't care what that, you know, that stuffy, bearded guy says at the Greenwich Observatory. I know when it's noon in Edinburgh, and it's not the same noon as in London. And a group of feminists actually bombed the observatory in Edinburgh because they saw it as a symbol of male oppression. So, you know, it took some time. So, yes, we're still dinosaurs in a way with AM/PM. So that's confusing. But even when you get to, you know, 24-hour time, unless you're on Zulu time or, you know, military or that the airlines use, where they take Greenwich Mean Time and it's 24 hours from there all across the world. In other places, even the 24-hour system is different if you're not, you know, starting at the same place. So Swatch, you know, that watch company, about 20 years ago, they said, you know, let's take the next step finally. You know, we're not stupid here. You know, it's like the metric system where we still don't use it. You know, well, let's have universal time. So they established this system called beats, where in Switzerland, which would be the central time marcation, that would be 0, and it would go from 0 to 1,000 beats over the daytime. And it would be the same darn time everywhere in the world. So if it was, and I actually have 2 watches that Swatch made 20 years ago that are beat watches. So if it says it's 374, it's 374 in North Reading, and it's 374 in Tokyo and Bangkok and Moscow. It's the same time everywhere. So when you're calling your kid who's in school in Taipei, you know, well, wait, what time is it? Is he sleeping? You know, it's, and you know, we get used to it. You know, right now, well, how do you know what time to eat? you know, I think pretty soon we'd know at 374, you know, was time for breakfast. You know, we figured out. But anyway, that watch system went nowhere. They even put up a couple of satellites, you know, that would be at beat time. So, you know, I think, you know, 100 years or whatever, you never look back and say, what were these people thinking? This is like when they had 700 time zones. You still have, you know, it's 1 o'clock here and it's 5 o'clock here, and in India it's 4:30 there because they're on some half-hour time zone system. So it's, you know, maybe, you know, when if we live long enough to see, you know, at least everybody on 24-hour time here in America, you know, that would be a start. So we're not in the AM PM thing, because I mean I actually got messed up because I made a train reservation in England, and I got mixed up on AM PM, and I bought tickets for like 4:15 a.m. and then, I mean, luckily I realized it before we showed up at the train station, but you know, I had to eat that $120, you know, because I had screwed up. So let's hear it for Beats. Yes, sir.
Is there sort of the equivalent of like a Mona Lisa of New England clocks, in the sense of sort of rarest, most priceless, you know, one of a kind that you can think of, sort of the apex clock?
Well, the rarest and most expensive, most collectible are called astronomical regulators, because they were big floor-standing clocks that were super precise and built for high precision, that were used in astronomical observatories and for time standardization. William Bond was the premier clock and watchmaker in Boston in the middle of the 1800s. And he had an astronomical regulator, and he supplied the time from his observatory to the railroads and the public buildings around and all too. So, and a lot of those were made by the Howard Company that I showed you the picture of their factory. So there are collectors of those, but as you know, they certainly didn't make many of them. They were hugely expensive. They had a specific purpose. But you also may know from astronomy, you needed extremely accurate timekeeping to time the transits of stars and the movements of planets and things, so you could figure out the physics of things. So, the people, so these are not decorative things. I mean, they're pretty, but the people who want sort of the apex timekeeper would want an astronomical regulator, and I'd be happy to find one and sell it to you.
So they were practically like scientific instruments.
Exactly. Yeah, and one place you can see them, speaking of scientific instruments, is the Harvard collection of scientific instruments. It's in their science building right off Harvard Square. They have a beautiful little museum there, and they have, including by Bond, they have astronomical regulators in there. So those all have mercury pendulums. There's like 50 pounds of mercury that's in the pendulum, and it's for temperature compensation, because the pendulum rod would expand and contract with temperature. So if your pendulum grows longer, your clock slows down. So you need a system to compensate for that. So if you have mercury in the bottom and it gets hotter in the room, the mercury is going to grow up as the pendulum grows down and keep the period of the pendulum going in the same way.
Like on a mercury thermometer.
Yes, yes. So it was...
what kind of time period was that type of clock developed?
These astronomical regulators began in about the 1850s or 40s, because already the astronomers needed accurate timekeeping. And of course, there's the whole John Harrison story, finding longitude, that predates that, where those portable timekeepers that could be accurate within a few seconds a month, which they had to be, or else you were on the rocks or the bottom of the ocean. That happened too. I mean, I own 3 early 1800s chronometers, that are just incredible, beautiful machines. So if you don't have room for an astronomical regulator, you could have a little boxed chronometer that was on some ship that probably, went to Asia, and didn't hit the rocks because their chronometer was still working. But I mean, those are beautiful. But those don't have to cost tens of thousands of dollars. I think, my chronometers were maybe $2,000 or $3,000, $4,000 for thing. And they were standard issue on ships before before radio and other means. Every battleship in World War II had 3 of them. So that if the ship got hit somewhere, they still had another one. But if you think about it, you need either 1 or 3, because if you have 2, you don't know which one is right. So 1, you figure, okay, this one's right. 3, 2 of them agree, okay. 2, you have no idea what time it is.
Toss a coin.
Yeah, yes.
I noticed when you had all the pictures of the clock towers, that some of them only had one that faced the street, and some of them had multiple sides.
Yes.
I'm going to assume they all ran off the same movement?
Yes.
But was that more difficult to
Yeah.
manage?
Yes. I probably don't have a picture here again, but the drive shaft would come straight up out of the movement, and then there'd be universal joints essentially that would go out to the 4 dials. So, you know, it was a lot of friction. That's why you had a lot of weight to run those things. But sometimes they figured, you know, if one face of the steeple faced the woods, you know, or the house of the guy they didn't like, you know, then they didn't put a dial on that side because that was all extra expense. And again, extra power needed. All those hands are counterweighted, by the way, because, you know, if the movement's trying to pull this big heavy thing uphill, you know, it would stop the clock. So they had a tail on it that weighed the same as the hand on the other side. So it could do it. But if a pigeon landed on the hand, sometimes that was enough to stop the clock because it was trying to drag this extra, you know, 4 ounces uphill.
What about the winter, like with snow?
That's a factor in it, and tower clocks have that problem. If they get iced up and all, you can have stoppages for that reason. So you need lubricants, and you need, you know, the keeper to be there. And if the guy's in charge of the clock and getting paid by the town, you know, £4 a week for taking care of the clock in the 1700s, and the clock stops, you know, everybody knows who to blame. So, you know, they don't hear that bell anymore, and better call Ebenezer, get him over here. Yeah.
Of course, like in this town, like, I'm old enough, I remember the clock tower would chime.
Yes.
But eventually, as time went on, 1970s, I think, it was like the neighbors just said, stop the thing. I didn't want to hear it at 2 a.m.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are systems that can silence them at night too, but now again, everybody knows they're not lying in bed wondering what time it is. You know, they can find out too easily what time it is.
Right.
So Scott, no music-related question for me here? Metronome or something?
Seth Thomas.
Yeah, they made metronomes.
Seth Thomas, I recognize that from childhood, the old wooden metronomes.
Yes, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I had one too. All right. Yeah, Scott is a well-known composer and musician that lives here in your town. So.
They went with those bad old piano teachers that made you do like 1,000 scales every night.
Yeah. With the metronome. Yeah, a lot of metronomes probably ended up with bullet holes in them or tire tracks over them, right? That's fun. All right, well, is it cookie time? I'm still happy to talk informally.